the events of October 7th were just enormously painful for so many people. And I would love to just hear kind of how that hit you, where you were, how that impacted you. And I know that so many people in Israel and the Jewish population just felt like the tragedy of that was just ignited a deep, deep hurt and pain and suffering. And so I'm curious, like, how was that when you first heard of that news, and how did that land with you?
October the 7th found me in Belgrade, Serbia, the former Yugoslavia. I was undertaking a 10-day speaking tour through the former Yugoslavia. From Belgrade, my next stop was going to be Sarajevo.
Wow.
And as you know, there was terrible history between the Serbs and the Muslims of Bosnia-Herzegovina in the 1990s with awful events that befell people, with horrible suffering inflicted mostly on the Muslim population, but there were mutual atrocities.
Yeah.
And this was part of an effort on the part of the Djokovic Foundation, the tennis player Novak Djokovic and his wife Jelena, to bring some healing, new attitudes towards child development, preventing future trauma. It was in that setting that this terrible news of what happened on October 7th struck me. And my first reaction was really, it was beyond speech. It was just deep sorrow, grief for all the suffering that was being inflicted on that day on the civilians in Israel, which nothing that I will say in the ensuing conversation can possibly justify. So there's no justification here for that kind of suffering, for that kind of atrocity. At the same time, knowing something of the history, I knew what was going to come down. I knew the terrible suffering that Israel was going to impose on the Palestinians, including the civilian population. There's been too many instances of that, and I was just terribly worried about everything that's was going to happen, and of course has happened since. So I had this double reaction of being appalled at the atrocities of that day and terribly worried about the further atrocities that will follow. That was my reaction. And I was interviewed in Canadian television and radio. I spoke briefly, one of these 5-minute interviews where you have to compress 80 years of history into...
I know I reached out to you around that time. I said, can we do a Zoom on this? You said, wait, let me wait till we get home till I can kind of like actually give it the time and attention that it needs. So that's partly how we showed up here today, with your desire to really speak to it in a thoughtful, clear way when you have some time.
I mean, my initial reaction was, yes, let's do it. And I was going to do it at 10 o'clock in the evening from Sarajevo. That would have been a big mistake. But when I did speak on Canadian media, I immediately quoted both Israeli and Palestinian friends of mine who had reached out to me for support. An Israeli woman who was a psychologist, who was very sympathetic to the Palestinian cause, but who was just appalled and in fear because she had to evacuate her home with her daughter. And she was working with traumatized people. I heard from a Palestinian friend who lives in Ramallah, whose neck had been broken by the Israeli army at a peaceful demonstration. She's been through a lot. Now she's pregnant, and she was terribly worried about the impact of all this on her yet unborn child. And it was ironic because I knew about the study that was done in 1967 on Israeli women. In the lead up to the 67 war, there was a lot of anxiety, stress, and angst in that country. Women pregnant then, their children were more likely to develop schizophrenia as adults. So I knew that what was going on right now is going to have ramifications, reverberations for generations. Just more trauma, more suffering for everyone. It felt awful.